morning. I'm about to read a chapter in the book Nexus by Noah Yuval Harari titled Decisions, A Brief History of Democracy and Totalitarianism. And I'm going to share this with everybody because I feel like this is the topic of the day. And most people don't have this book. And maybe most people don't want this book, but if I'm reading it anyway, I might as well share it. So, let's see. You don't want to stare at me this whole time, book either, but I don't think it really matters. Let's see. How about this view? This is a silly view, but it's what we're gonna do. Okay. Chapter 5, Decisions, A Brief History of Democracy and Totalitarianism. Democracy and dictatorship are typically discussed as contrasting political and ethical systems. This chapter seeks to shift the terms of the discussion by surveying the history of democracy and dictatorship as contrasting types of information networks. And it examines how information in democracies flows differently than in dictatorial systems, and how inventing new information technologies helps different kinds of regimes flourish. Dictatorial information networks are highly centralized. This means two things. First, the center enjoys unlimited authority. Hence, information tends to flow to the central hub, where the most important decisions are made. In the Roman Empire, all roads lead to Rome. In Nazi Germany, information flowed to Berlin, and in the Soviet Union to Moscow. Sometimes the central government attempts to concentrate all information in its hands and to dictate all decisions by itself, controlling the totality of people's lives. This totalizing form of dictatorship practiced by the likes of Hitler and Stalin is known as totalitarianism. But not every dictatorship is totalitarian. Technical difficulties often prevent dictators from becoming totalitarian. The Roman Emperor Nero, for example, didn't have the means to micromanage the lives of millions of peasants in remote provincial villages. In many dictatorial regimes, considerable autonomy is therefore left to individuals, corporations, and communities. However, the dictators always retain the authority to intervene in people's lives. In Nero's Rome, freedom was not an ideal, but a byproduct of a government's inability to exert totalitarian control. The second characteristic of dictatorial networks is that they assume the center is infallible. They therefore dislike any challenge to the center's decisions. Soviet propaganda depicted Stalin as an infallible genius, and Roman propaganda treated emperors as divine beings. Even when Stalin or Nero made a patently disastrous decision, there was no robust self-correcting mechanism in the Soviet Union or the Roman Empire that could expose the mistake and push for a better course of action. In theory, a highly centralized information network could try to maintain strong self-correcting mechanisms, like independent courts and elected legislative bodies. But if they functioned well, these would challenge the central authority and thereby decentralize the information network. Dictators always see such independent power hubs as threats and seek to neutralize them. This is what happened in the Roman Senate, whose power was whittled away by successive Caesars until it became little more than a rubber stamp for imperial whims. The same fate befell the Soviet judicial system, which never dared resist the will of the Communist Party. Stalinist show trials, as their name indicates, were theater with preordained results. To summarize, a dictatorship is a centralized information network lacking strong self-correcting mechanisms. A democracy, in contrast, is a distributed information network possessing strong self-correcting mechanisms. When we look at a democratic information network, we do see a central hub. The government is the most important executive power in a democracy, and government agencies therefore gather and store vast quantities of information. But there are many additional information channels that connect lots of independent nodes. Legislative bodies, political parties, courts, the press, corporations, local communities, NGOs, and individual citizens communicate freely and directly with one another so that most information never passes through any government agency, and many important decisions are made elsewhere. Individuals choose for themselves where they live, where to work, and whom to marry. Corporations make their own choices about where to open a branch, how much to invest in certain projects, and how much to charge for goods and services. Communities decide for themselves about organizing charities, sporting events, and religious festivals. Autonomy is not a consequence of the government's ineffectiveness. It is the democratic ideal. Even if it possesses the technology necessary to micromanage people's lives, the democratic government leaves as much room as possible for people to make their own choices. A common misconception is that in a democracy, everything is decided by majority vote. In fact, in a democracy, as little as possible is decided centrally, and only the relatively few decisions that must be made centrally should reflect the will of the majority. In a democracy, if 99% of people want to dress in a particular way and worship a particular god, the remaining 1% should still be free to dress and worship differently. Of course, if the central government doesn't intervene at all in people's lives and doesn't provide them with basic services like security, it isn't a democracy. It is anarchy. In all democracies, the center raises taxes and maintains an army, and in most modern democracies, it also provides at least some level of health care, education, and welfare. But any intervention in people's lives demands an explanation. In the absence of a compelling reason, a democratic government should leave people to their own devices. Another crucial characteristic of democracies is that they assume everyone is fallible. Therefore, while democracies give the censor the authority to make some vital decisions, they also maintain strong mechanisms that can challenge the central authority. To paraphrase President James Madison, since humans are fallible, a government is necessary. But since government, too, is fallible, it needs mechanisms to expose and correct its errors, such as holding regular elections, protecting the freedom of the press, and separating the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. Consequently, while a dictatorship is about one central information hub dictating everything, a democracy is an ongoing conversation between diverse information nodes. The nodes often influence one another, but in most matters, they are not obliged to reach a consensus. Individuals, corporations, and communities can continue to think and behave in different ways. There are, of course, cases when everyone must behave the same and diversity cannot be tolerated. For example, when in 2002 to 2003 Americans disagreed about whether to invade Iraq, everyone ultimately had to abide by a single decision. It was unacceptable that some Americans would maintain a private peace with Saddam Hussein while others declared war. Whether good or bad, the decision to invade Iraq committed every American citizen. So also when initiating national infrastructure projects or defining criminal offenses. No country can function well if every person is allowed to lay a separate rail network or to have their own definition of murder. In order to make decisions on such collective matters, a countrywide public conversation must first be held, following which the people's representatives, elected in free and fair elections, make a choice. But even after that choice has been made, it should remain open to re-examination and correction. While the network cannot change its previous choices, it can elect a different government next time. Majority dictatorships. definition of democracy as a distributed information network with strong self-correcting mechanisms stands in sharp contrast to a common misconception that equates democracy only with elections. Elections are a central part of the democratic toolkit, but they are not democracy. In the absence of additional self-correcting mechanisms, elections can easily be rigged. Even if the elections are completely free and fair, by itself this too does not guarantee democracy. For democracy is not the same thing as majority dictatorship. Suppose that in a free and fair election, 51% of voters choose a government that subsequently sends 1% of voters to be exterminated in death camps because they belong to some hated religious minority. Is this democratic? Clearly, it is not. The problem isn't that genocide demands a special majority of more than 51%. It's not that if the government gets the backing of 60%, 75%, or even 99% of voters, then its death camps finally become democratic. A democracy is not a system in which a majority of any size can decide to exterminate unpopular minorities. It is a system in which there are clear limits on the power of the censor. Suppose 51% of votes choose a government that then takes away the voting rights of the other 49% of voters, or perhaps of just 1% of them. Is that democratic? Again, the answer is no, and it has nothing to do with the numbers. Disenfranchising political rivals dismantles one of the vital self-correcting mechanisms of democratic networks. Elections are a mechanism for the network to say, we made a mistake, let's try something else. But if the center can disenfranchise people at will, that self-correcting mechanism is neutered. These two examples may sound outlandish, but they are unfortunately within the realm of the possible. Hitler began sending Jews and communists to concentration camps within months of rising to power through democratic elections. And in the United States, numerous democratically elected governments have disenfranchised African Americans, Native Americans, and other oppressed populations. Of course, most assaults on democracy are more subtle. The careers of strong men like Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Rodrigo Duterte, Jair Bolsonaro, and Benjamin Netanyahu demonstrate how a leader who uses democracy to rise to power can then use his power to undermine democracy. As Erdogan once put it, democracy is like a tram. You ride it until you arrive at your destination. Then you step off. The most common method strongmen use to undermine democracy is to attack its self-correcting mechanisms one by one, often beginning with the courts and the media. The typical strongman either deprives courts of their powers or pushes them with his loyalists and seeks to close all independent media, while building his own omnipresent propaganda machine. Once the courts are no longer able to check the government's power by legal means, and once the media obediently parrots the government line, all other institutions or persons who dare oppose the government can be smeared and persecuted as traitors, criminals, or foreign agents. Academic institutions, municipalities, NGOs, and private businesses are either dismantled or brought under government control. At that stage, the government can also rig the elections at will. For example, by jailing popular opposition leaders, preventing opposition parties from participating in the elections, gerrymandering election districts, or disenfranchising voters. Appeals against these anti-democratic measures are dismissed by the government's hand-picked judges. Journalists and academics who criticize these measures are fired. The remaining media outlets Academic institutions and judicial authorities all praise these measures as necessary steps to protect the nation and its allegedly democratic system from traitors and foreign agents. The strong men don't usually take the final step of abolishing the elections outright. Instead, they keep them as a ritual that provides legitimacy and maintains a democratic facade, as happens, for example, in Putin's Russia. Supporters of strong men often don't see this process as anti-democratic. They are genuinely baffled when told the electoral victory doesn't grant them unlimited power. Instead, they see any check on the power as an elected government as undemocratic. However, democracy doesn't mean majority rule. Rather, it means freedom and equality for all. Democracy is a system that guarantees everyone certain liberties, which even the majority cannot take away. Nobody disputes that in a democracy. Nobody disputes that in a democracy, the representatives of the majority are entitled to form the government and to advance their preferred policies in myriad fields. If the majority wants war, the country goes to war. If the majority wants peace, the country makes peace. If the majority wants to raise taxes, taxes are raised. If the majority wants to lower taxes, taxes are lowered. Major decisions about foreign affairs, defense, education, taxation, and numerous other policies are all in all in the hands of the majority. But in a democracy, there are two baskets of rights that are protected from the majority's grasp. One contains human rights. Even if 99% of the population wants to exterminate the remaining 1%, in a democracy this is forbidden because it violates the most basic human right, the right to live. The basket of human rights contains many additional rights, such as the right to work, the right to privacy, freedom of movement, and freedom of religion. These rights enshrine the decentralized nature of democracy, making sure that as long as people don't harm anyone, they can live their lives as they see fit. The second crucial basket of rights contains civil rights. These are the basic rules of the democratic game, which enshrine its self-correcting mechanisms. An obvious example is the right to vote. If the majority were permitted to disenfranchise the minority, then democracy would be over after a single election. Other civil rights include freedom of the press, academic freedom, and freedom of assembly, which enable independent media outlets, universities, and opposition movements to challenge the government. These are the key rights that strongmen seek to violate. While sometimes it is necessary to make changes to a country's self-correcting mechanisms, for example, by expanding the franchise, regulating the media, or reforming the judicial system, such changes should be made only on the basis of a broad consensus, including both majority and minority groups. If a small majority could unilaterally change civil rights, it could easily rig elections and get rid of all other checks on its power. An important thing to note about both human rights and civil rights is that they don't just limit the power of the central government, they also impose on it many active duties. It is not enough for a democratic government to abstain from infringing on human and civil rights. It must take action to ensure them. For example, the right of life imposes on a democratic government the duty to protect citizens from criminal violence. If a government doesn't kill anyone, but also makes no effort to protect citizens from murder, this is anarchy rather than democracy. The people versus the truth. Of course, in every democracy, there are lengthy discussions concerning the exact limits of human and civil rights. Even the right to life has limits. There are democratic countries like the United States that impose the death penalty, thereby denying some criminals the right to life. And every country allows itself to the prerogative of the prerogative to declare war, thereby sending people to kill and be killed. So where exactly does the right to life end? There are also complicated and ongoing discussions concerning the list of rights that should be included in the two baskets. Who determined that freedom of religion is a basic human right? Should internet access be defined as a civil right? And what about animal rights or the rights of AI? We cannot resolve these matters here. Both human and civil rights are intersubjective conventions that humans invent rather than discover, but they are determined by historical contingencies rather than universal reason. Different democracies can adopt somewhat different lists of rights, at least from the viewpoint of information flows. What defines a system as democratic is only that its center doesn't have unlimited authority, and that the system possesses robust mechanisms to correct the center's mistakes. Democratic networks assume that everyone is fallible, and that includes even the winners of elections and the majority of voters. It is particularly crucial to remember that elections are not a method for discovering truth. Rather, they are a method for maintaining order by adjudicating between people's conflicting desires. Elections establish what the majority of people desire rather than what is true. And people often desire the truth to be other than what it is. Democratic networks therefore maintain some self-correcting mechanisms to protect the truth, even from the will of the majority. For example, during the 2002-2003 debate over whether to invade Iraq in the wake of September 11 attacks, the Bush administration claimed that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction and that the Iraqi people were eager to establish an American-style democracy and would welcome the Americans as liberators. These arguments carried the day. In October 2002, the elected representatives of the American people in Congress voted overwhelmingly to authorize the invasion. The resolution passed with a 296 to 133 majority, 69% in the House of Representatives, and 77 to 23 majority, 77% in the Senate. In that early days of war in March 2003, polls found that the elected representatives were indeed in tune with the mass of voters, and that 72% of American citizens supported the invasion. The will of the American people was clear. But the truth turned out to be different from what the government said and what the majority believed. As the war progressed, it became evident that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, and that many Iraqis had no wish to be liberated by the Americans or to establish a democracy. By August 2004, another poll found that 67% of Americans believed that the invasion was based on incorrect assumptions. As the years went by, most Americans acknowledged that the decision to invade was a catastrophic mistake. In a democracy, the majority has every right to make momentous decisions like starting wars, and that includes the right to make momentous errors. But the majority should at least acknowledge its own fallibility and protect the freedom of minorities to hold and publicize unpopular views, which might turn out to be correct. As another example, consider the case of a charismatic leader who is accused of corruption. His loyal supporters obviously wish these accusations to be false. But even if most voters support the leader, their desire should not prevent judges from investigating the accusations and getting to the truth. As with the justice system, so also with science. The majority of voters might deny the reality of climate change, but they should not have the power to dictate scientific truth or to prevent scientists from exploring and publishing inconvenient facts. Unlike parliaments, departments of environmental studies should not reflect the will of the majority. Of course, when it comes to making policy decisions about climate change in a democracy, the will of the voters should reign supreme. Acknowledging the reality of climate change does not tell us what to do about it. We always have options, and choosing between them is a question of desire, not truth. One option might be to immediately get greenhouse gas emissions, cut greenhouse gas emissions, even at the cost of slowing economic growth. This means incurring some difficulties today, but saving people in 2050 from more severe hardship, saving the island nation of Kiribati from drowning, and saving the polar bears from extinction. A second option might be to continue with business as usual. This means having an easier life today, but making life harder for the next generation, flooding Kiribati and driving the polar bears, as well as numerous other species, to extinction. Choosing between these two options is a question of desire, and should therefore be done by all voters rather than by a limited group of experts. But the one option that should not be an offer in elections is hiding or distorting the truth. If the majority prefers to consume whatever amount of fossil fuels it wishes with no regard to future generations or other environmental considerations, it is entitled to vote for that. But the majority should not be entitled to pass a law stating that climate change is a hoax and that all professors who believe in climate change must be fired from their academic posts. We can choose what we want, but we shouldn't deny the true meaning of our choice. Naturally, academic institutions, the media, and the judiciary may themselves be compromised by corruption, bias, or error. But subordinating them to a governmental ministry of truth is likely to make things worse. The government is already the most powerful institution in developed societies, and it often has the greatest interest in distorting or hiding inconvenient facts. Allowing the government to supervise the search for truth is like appointing the fox to guard the chicken coop. To discover the truth, it is better to rely on two other methods. First, academic institutions, the media, and the judiciary have their own internal self-correcting mechanisms for fighting corruption, correcting bias, and exposing error. In academia, peer-reviewed publication is a far better check on error than supervision by government, because academic promotion often depends on uncovering past mistakes and discovering unknown facts. In the media, free competition means that if one outlet decides not to break a scandal, perhaps for self-serving reasons, others are likely to jump at the scoop. In the judiciary, a judge who takes bribes may be tried and punished just like any other citizen. Second, the existence of several independent institutions that seek the truth in different ways allows these institutions to check and correct one another. For example, if powerful corporations manage to break down the peer review mechanisms by bribing a sufficiently large number of scientists, investigative journalists and courts can expose and punish the perpetrators. If the media or the courts are afflicted by systematic racist biases, it is the job of sociologists, historians, and philosophers to expose these biases. None of these mechanisms are completely fail-safe, but no human institution is. Government certainly isn't. The populist assault. If all of this sounds complicated, it is because democracy should be complicated. Simplicity is a characteristic of dictatorial information networks in which the center dictates everything and everybody silently obeys. It is easy to follow this dictatorial monologue. In contrast, democracy is a conversation with numerous participants, many of them talking at the same time. It can be hard to follow such a conversation. Moreover, the most important democratic institutions tend to be bureaucratic behemoths. Whereas citizens avidly follow the biographical dramas of the princely court and the presidential palace, they often find it difficult to understand how parliaments, courts, newspapers, and universities function. This is what helps strongmen mount populist attacks on institutions, dismantle all self-correcting mechanisms, and concentrate power in their own hands. We discussed populism briefly in the prologue to help explain the populist challenge to the naive view of information. Here we need to revisit populism, get a broader understanding of its worldview, and explain its appeal to anti-democratic strongmen. The term populism derives from the Latin populus, which means the people. In democracies, the people is considered the sole legitimate source of political authority. Only representatives of the people should have the authority to declare wars, pass laws, and raise taxes. Populists cherish this basic democratic principle, but somehow conclude from it that a single party or a single leader should monopolize all power. In a curious political alchemy, populists managed to base a totalitarian pursuit of unlimited power on a seemingly impeccable democratic principle. How does that happen? The most novel claim populists make is that they alone truly represent the people. Since in democracies only the people should have political power, and since allegedly only the populace represent the people, it follows that the Populist Party should have all political power itself. If some party other than the populace wins election, it does not mean that the rival party won the people's trust and is entitled to form a government. Rather, it means that the elections were stolen, or that the people were deceived to vote in a way that doesn't express their true will. It should be stressed that for many populists, this is a genuinely held belief rather than a propaganda gambit. Even if they win just a small share of votes, populists may still believe that they alone represent the people. An analogous case are communist parties. In the UK, for example, the Communist Party of Great Britain never won more than 0.4% of votes in a general election, but was nevertheless adamant that it alone truly represented the working class. Millions of British workers, they claimed, were voting for the Labour Party or even the Conservative Party rather than for the CPGB because of false consciousness. Allegedly, through their control of the media, universities, and other institutions, the capitalists managed to deceive the working class into voting against its true interests, and only the CPGB could see through this deception. In like fashion, populists can believe that the enemies of the people have deceived the people to vote against its true will, which the populists alone represent. A fundamental part of this populist credo is the belief that the people is not a collection of flesh and blood individuals with various interests and opinions, but rather a unified mystical body that possesses a single will, the will of the people. Perhaps the most notorious and extreme manifestation of this semi-religious belief was the Nazi motto, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, which means our people, our country, one people, one country, one leader. Nazi ideology posited the people had a single will, whose sole authentic representative was the leader. The leader allegedly had an infallible intuition for how the people felt and what the people wanted. If some German citizens disagreed with the leader, it didn't mean that the leader might be wrong. Rather, it meant that the dissenters belonged to some treasonous outsider group, Jews, communists, liberals, instead of to the people. The Nazi case is, of course, extreme, and it is grossly unfair to accuse all populists of being crypto-Nazis with genocidal inclinations. However, many populist parties and politicians deny that the people might contain a diversity of opinions and interest groups. They insist that the real people has only one will, and that they alone represent this will. In contrast, their political rivals, even when the latter enjoys substantial popular support, are depicted as alien elites. Thus, Hugo Chavez ran for the presidency in Venezuela with the slogan, "Chavez is the people." President Erdogan of Turkey once railed against his domestic critics, saying, "We are the people, who are you?" as if his critics weren't Turks too. How can you tell then whether someone is part of the people or not? Easy. If they support the leader, they are part of the people. This, according to the German political philosopher Jan Werner Miller, is the defining feature of populism. What turns someone into a populist is claiming that they alone represent the people and that anyone who disagrees with them, whether State bureaucrats, minority groups, or even the majority of voters either suffers from false consciousness or isn't really part of the people. This is why populism poses a deadly threat to democracy. While democracy agrees that the people is the only legitimate source of power, democracy is based on the understanding that the people is never a unitary entity and therefore cannot possess a single will. Every people, whether Germans, Venezuelans, or Turks, is composed of many different groups with a polarity of opinions, wills, and representatives. No group, including the majority group, is entitled to exclude other groups from membership in the people. This is what makes democracy a conversation. Holding a conversation presupposes the existence of several legitimate voices. If, however, the people has only one legitimate voice, there can be no conversation. Rather, the single voice dictates everything. Populism may therefore claim adherence to the democratic principle of people's power, but it effectively empties democracy of meaning and seeks to establish a dictatorship. Populism undermines democracy in another more subtle but equally dangerous way. Having claimed that they alone represent the people, populists argue that the people is not just the sole legitimate source of political authority, but the sole legitimate source of all authority. Any institution that derives its authority from something other than the will of the people is anti-democratic. As the self-proclaimed representatives of the people, populists consequently seek to monopolize not just political authority, but all types of authority, and to take control of institutions such as media outlets, courts, and universities. By taking the democratic principle of people's power to its extreme, populists turn totalitarian. In fact, while democracy means that authority is the political sphere, in the political sphere, comes from the people, it doesn't deny the validity of alternative sources of authority in other spheres. As discussed above, in a democracy, independent media outlets, courts, and universities are essential self-correcting mechanisms that protect the truth even from the will of the majority. Biology professors claim that humans evolved from apes because the evidence supports this, even if the majority wills it to be otherwise. Journalists can reveal that a popular politician took a bribe, and if compelling evidence is presented to a court, a judge may send that politician to jail, even if most people don't want to believe these accusations. Populists are suspicious of institutions that in the name of objective truths override the supposed will of the people. They tend to see this as a smokescreen for elites grabbing illegitimate power. This drives populists to be skeptical of the pursuit of truth and to argue, as we saw in the prologue, that power is the only reality. They thereby seek to undercut or appropriate the authority of any independent institutions that might oppress them. The result is a dark and cynical view of the world as a jungle and of human beings as creatures obsessed with power alone. All social interactions are seen as power struggles, and all institutions are depicted as cliques promoting the interests of their own members. In the populist imagination, courts don't really care about justice. They only protect the privileges of the judges. Yes, the judges talk a lot about justice, but this is a ploy to grab power for themselves. Newspapers don't care about facts. They spread fake news to mislead the people and benefit the journalists and the cabals that finance them. Even scientific institutions aren't committed to the truth. Biologists, climatologists, epidemiologists, economists, historians, and mathematicians are just another interest group featuring its own nest at the expense of the people, feathering its own nest at the expense of the people. In all, it is a rather sordid view of humanity, but two things nevertheless make it appealing to many. First, since it reduces all interactions to power struggle, it simplifies reality and makes events like wars, economic crises, and natural disasters easy to understand. Anything that happens, even a pandemic, is about elites pursuing power. Second, the populist view is attractive because it is sometimes correct. Every human institution is indeed fallible and suffers from some level of corruption. Some judges do take bribes. Some journalists do intentionally mislead the public. Academic disciplines are occasionally plagued by bias and nepotism. That is why every institution needs self-correcting mechanisms. But since populists are convinced that power is the only reality, They cannot accept that a court, a media outlet, or an academic discipline would ever be inspired by the value of truth or justice to correct itself. While many people embrace populism because they see it as an honest account of human reality, strong men are attracted to it for a different reason. Populism offers strongmen an ideological basis for making themselves dictators while pretending to be democrats. It is particularly useful when strongmen seek to neutralize or appropriate the self-correcting mechanisms of democracy. Since judges, journalists, and professors allegedly pursue political interests rather than the truth, the people's champion, the strong man, should control these positions instead of allowing them to fall into the hands of the people's enemies. Similarly, since even the officials in charge of arranging elections and publicizing the results may be part of a nefarious conspiracy, they too should be replaced by the strong man's loyalists. In a well-functioning democracy, citizens trust the results of elections, the decisions of courts, the reports of media outlets, and the findings of scientific disciplines because citizens believe these institutions are committed to the truth. Since people think that power is the only reality, they lose trust in all these institutions. Democracy collapses and the strong man can seize total power. Of course, populism could lead to anarchy rather than totalitarianism if it undermines trust in the strongmen themselves. If no human is interested in truth or justice, doesn't this apply to Mussolini or Putin too? And if no human institution can have effective self-correcting mechanisms, doesn't this include Mussolini's National Fascist Party or Putin's United Russia Party? How can a deep-seated distrust of all elites and institutions be squared with unwavering admiration for one leader and party? This is why populists ultimately depend on the mystical notion that the strong man embodies the people. When trust in bureaucratic institutions like election boards, courts, and newspapers is particularly low, an enhanced reliance on mythology is the only way to preserve order. Enlightened anarchy, anyone?